some general announcements. I'm Suzanne Sharon. I run the Scholars Guild, and I'll come up with it. We got so many people here tonight. As I said before, there are snacks in the back, either now or after the event. There's a basket for donations. If you can throw a couple dollars in there, that would be wonderful. We are going to be on YouTube, so you won't be seen in the audience, but your voice will be heard. So, with regard to that, we have a monthly announcement. The Scholars Gild is dedicated to inclusivity and justice. We ask all comments be cognizant of racial and gender equality and be sensitive to diverse identities of audience members. I'd like you to also make sure your phones are silent. And next month, we're going to have our own Barbara Macklin talk about the history of Arden. So right now, Jennifer Borders is going to introduce our guest speaker for tonight.
Hi, everybody. Dr. Roger Latham started working as an environmental planner, conservation biologist, and research ecologist in the year that the Endangered Species Act was signed into the law, 1973. After earning his Ph.D. in biology at the University of Pennsylvania, he served as Director of Science and Stewardship for the Nature Conservancy, postdoctoral researcher in biochemistry of bioecology at the University of Pennsylvania's Department of Geology, and assistant professor in the Department of Biology at Swarthmore. Since 2000, he has been a full-time consultant doing applied research and planning for the National Park Service, the Nature Conservancy, Audubon, several mid-Atlantic states conservation departments, and other organizations. Among many pro bono conservation activities, he is the founding chair, serving since 2008 on the Environmental Advisory Council of Rose Valley, Pennsylvania, our sister. I give you, Roger.
Introduction. Yes, I feel pretty at home here in Arden, being a Rose Valley for 31 years. I'm almost a native by now, not quite. I'm speaking with you with a great amount of relief. I walked into the Gild Hall and I'm so glad that I don't have to sing, as I was assumed to be here for. You don't want to hear me sing. So, topic for today is how deer affect quality of life, ecosystems, biodiversity. And my talk is going to be around some of these questions. You know, deer, who doesn't love deer? They're one of our most beautiful members of our wildlife. They're amazing creatures. How in the world, what is it that they could possibly be a pest? And what are we losing as a result of their great population explosion? And what can we do about it? Those are my take homes. First, how did this happen in the first place? Well, deer population, as you probably know, is at an all-time high. I took this picture in Valley Forge National Historical Park, and that's one of the places where deer population is even higher than it is in most other places around here. Why is this? Because we, humanity, human beings, created ideal deer habitat, and that means edge. Deer do not like to live in the deep, dark forest, and they are not real happy out in the plains, but they just love what we've done by chopping the landscape up into all kinds of patches of both. And we eliminated the predators that have stabilized the deer population for millions of years, literally. We'll talk a little more about that in a bit. And I want to introduce the concept to you of ecological carrying capacity. Here's one definition. Population of a keystone herbivore, and I'll explain the word keystone, what I mean by that. An area can support without substantially altering the vegetation and habitat of other wildlife. So in other words, the number of deer that we would like to have is the number that doesn't sort of reverberate throughout the ecosystem and cause problems for other species that have lived here for just as long as the deer have. But in a typical mid-Atlantic landscape, such as around here, ecological carrying capacity might be somewhere between 8 and 25 deer per square mile. Probably 8 is a more usual situation, but it all depends on what kind of food there is, food resources. If there's plenty of resources for everybody, then there's more deer can live there without harming other wildlife. And just for a comparison, in 2009, Valley Forge National Historical Park commissioned a census. It's a very, very difficult and expensive thing to do, but they're part of the federal government. They did it, and they had 241 deer per square mile.
Wow, per square mile.
So why am I showing you this forest? This is another kind of forest than the forest we have around here. This is a kelp forest. And this is where we first understood the concept of keystone species. And we understand that we got that bit of knowledge the hard way by creating a catastrophe. So this is an example of a keystone predator. And we didn't know they were a keystone predator. This is a sea otter. And back hundreds of years ago, they started trapping the sea otters because they have fur that's extremely valuable and really good for coats, apparently. And then we found out when the sea otters were pretty much all trapped out, that they were a keystone species. In other words, without the sea otters, that forest disappeared, just completely disappeared. Thousands and thousands of species that depended on that, those kelp forests disappeared with them. And what caused that? Sea urchins, or sea urchins. As you can see, sea otters eat sea urchins. That's their favorite food. What happened was, once the sea otters were gone, the urchins exploded and they ate all the kelp. And the kelp was gone, and everything that depended on the kelp was gone too. So this is a keystone predator, and this is a keystone herbivore. The result was what people call urchin barrens. Just no forest anymore. And people lost out too, in a lot of ways, besides, you know, the enjoyment of knowing that the kelp forests that have been there millions of years were still healthy and intact. Kelp forests, as it turns out, are habitat for young fish. People like to fish and people like to eat fish, so those disappeared. And kelp forests also, they're so big, kelp plants, they're not plants, kelp, what would you call them, creatures, are so big that they mitigate the crashing of waves on the shore. And once those kelp forests were gone, there was a lot more shore erosion. So this is what is happening around here. This is an example of a white-tailed deer barrens. This is in northern Pennsylvania, where the deer have completely eaten every single species in the understory of the forest except one, which is a fern that they don't like. And that's it. Around here, you're more likely to see this kind of white-tailed deer barrens, where they've eaten everything almost except for stilt grass.
Oh, yeah.
Non-native invasive, as you may well know, all too well known.
Yes.
And stilt grass, they don't like either. Sadly, we can only get them to eat the stilt grass.
Can you turn it up a little?
That's just all I got there.
It's around here, 100% colored cover of garlic mustard, which has reverberations on down the food.
I got that garlic mustard in the yard.
Because, as you may or may not know, garlic mustard is allelopathic to the fungi that trees, mainly tree seedlings, depend on in order to mature. So just a couple of quick things that I'm not gonna dwell upon. Some of the other ramifications of the large population of deer we have now is our deer auto collisions. This is just one insurance company that didn't mind telling people that they had 18,000 claims per year in Pennsylvania alone. I usually give this talk in Pennsylvania. You're going to hear the word Pennsylvania a lot. And the statewide averages are 2,500 injury or towing cases and 8 human deaths per year on the roads. Lyme disease epidemic. The deer tick is kind of misnamed because it should be called the white-footed mouse tick, but it needs a deer or a human to reach maturity, and that's why we get Lyme disease. I personally have had it about 8 times.
Oh.
A little bit of garden and landscape damage, as you're well aware, I'm sure, if you're trying to grow tomatoes and kale and whatever else around here, yummy stuff, or landscape plants like here. But, so what are we losing? I told you what we've gained, not good things. And what are we losing? Well, the effects on our natural ecosystem of this size population of deer are all of these things, and I'm going to talk about each one in turn. But tree regeneration failure, collapse of native plant diversity, loss of forest structure. I'll tell you what that means in a minute. Decline in native animal diversity from all this. Increased cover by invasive plants, because you know what? Deer don't like invasive plants. So they let them proliferate until they cover the whole earth. And that leads, all of these things lead to self-reinforcing feedback loops, and it just makes the problem worse and worse and worse. Even if the deer left, those problems would still be there. We'll talk about that in a minute. Tree regeneration failure, this is an obvious thing. If you don't have baby trees, and these are baby trees in a healthy forest with just the right number of deer, baby oaks in particular are valuable, and in particular our deer candy. They live off of this stuff in the winter. Basically, deer in the winter, they don't have leaves to eat, so they eat the twigs and the bark of twigs. And that's why every single tree seedling that's native, that the deer have co-evolved with for millions of years, are gone where deer population is high by spring. And then it starts over again the next winter. And without tree regeneration, pretty soon there's no forest. And I've seen big areas in northern Pennsylvania which has had this problem for longer than most places, where there aren't trees replacing the ones that die, and there's vast areas that are treeless just because the trees have died and no new trees are coming along to replace them. And with that failure, you get carbon sequestration failure. Forests are one of the most effective and efficient capturers of the excess carbon dioxide that we're putting in the atmosphere. And without the trees growing, we don't get that effect. Collapse of native plant diversity. Here's a few species that are virtually gone from our area because deer particularly love them. That's ginseng up there, a couple of trilliums and an orchid. And it's not just forest plants that deer have made huge inroads on where their populations are very high. Here's a couple of open area, grassland, meadow type species that are now endangered in some areas. This is an endangered species in Pennsylvania. I'm trying to think of the common name and I can't. That's Philadelphia wood lily, which is a spectacularly beautiful plant that you probably have never seen because deer just love them. And by loss of vertical structure, I mean the shrub layer is gone, because deer like shrubs just as much as they like tree seedlings. They're a feast that they can reach during the winter because they have low branches. And here again are species that are virtually gone from vast areas where they used to be super abundant. That's called Hearts of Arden, which is a native euonymus. This is called Eastern Wahoo, which is another native euonymus. I bet you've never seen them in the wild. Has anybody? Wow, excellent. Where were you?
I've seen euonymus.
Excellent.
We've got it.
And it's not burning bush.
No. We've got that too.
We've checked.
Yeah,
We've got both.
this
We
is
got that.
this is hobblebush, which is a native viburnum with great big leaves that and rings of white flowers. That's pretty much gone from northern Pennsylvania, and that's American yew, which is very, very hard to find.
Hmm.
And there's lots of others. And that leads to a decline in native animal diversity. I think you all have, now mention him later, you all have, you know, Doug Palamy's work, and you probably, some many of you have heard him speak.
He spoke here.
Yeah, great, upstairs.
Yep.
You didn't make him sing. These are, I picked these in particular, these species in particular, because they are ones that research has shown have been decimated by high deer populations, in part because they eat away the cover of brown nesting birds like the wood thrush. Also because, well, one thing that deer do that really reverberates throughout the food web is that they eat away the native species that support, as Doug Talmy has already told you, that support the native insects that have co-evolved with those native species. The invasives, non-native species that have replaced our native species, because the deer don't eat them, the insects don't eat them either. And insects, E.O. Wilson said, insects are the little things that run
Engines
the
that
world.
make the world go round, something like that.
Say again?
Engines that make the world go round or something like that,
Yeah, something.
something like that.
In any case, it's true. No bird feeds its babies berries. Berries don't have, maybe a little bit for dessert now and again, but birds have to feed their babies insects because that's the only thing that has enough protein and fat to make a little baby turn into a, you know how fast birds grow, and they couldn't grow any other way than by insects, like being fed insects. And these insects, as I mentioned, don't eat burning bush and, you know, all the invasive
Butterfly
species.
weed,
Right?
butterfly bush, butterfly
Yeah,
bush.
the tragedy of the butterfly bush, the paradox of the butterfly bush. You plant butterfly bush, and for a while you have more butterflies just sipping the nectar. By and by, they've replaced all of the plants that the butterfly's larvae eat, and you got no more butterflies. And as I mentioned, increase in native and invasive species cover. Let's see, burning bush, completely dominant. Japanese barberry, still grass, garlic, mustard. Couple more, multiflora rose, and Japanese knotweed,
Got them
and
all.
lots and lots more. And that leads to a vicious cycle. And I think you've gotten the idea already that once these things take over, they prevent, even if the deer were to leave, they prevent native species from taking hold and growing again and restoring the food web. And so the more of these, the less native plants there are, the less food there is for the insects, the less food there is for the birds, et cetera, et cetera. Pretty soon you have a desert, but not in a good way. I've seen deserts with way more diversity than we have in some of our forests that look like this. So you don't believe me, delve into the scientific literature. They're actually, you know, since this happened in our area a long time ago, and it's progressed very slowly, and other areas where they have places that still have wolves and mountain lions, etc. and some areas that don't, and they can compare the two, which we don't have here in the east so much. They have quantified these effects, and you see articles like this. You're probably familiar with the wolf reintroduction in Yellowstone National Park. As soon as the wolves came back, the beavers came back, and the cottonwoods came back, and lots of things came back, because the elk numbers had risen so high that things were not good for all the other wildlife. And I'll get into this later, but it's not because the wolves killed all the elk by any means whatsoever. But the wolves scared the bejeebers out of the elk, and the elk stayed out of certain areas, and the elk spent a lot less time feeding. The whole ecosystem blossomed again. Got the same thing going on here. Here, cougars, and the whole thing. There's many, many scientific research papers about this subject. So out west, as we've shown here, our losses have been no less catastrophic than out west, but maybe more insidious. They don't make the news. So no, a lot of people are completely unaware. They see I don't know. I think there are some, I know there are some people who look at a stilt grass understory in a forest and say, how nice it looks, like a park. They happen slowly and gradually over time. And the key impact of that is that each generation grows up used to a new normal. And if there's 3 key ideas I'd like you to take home with you tonight, at least one of them is shifting baseline syndrome. We don't know what we've lost, really, because we haven't been around long enough to have enjoyed and observed how things were when they were better. And people, our grandparents maybe knew things that were a little better, but they probably weren't as good as what their grandparents observed. So, in other words, we kind of don't know any better. And another key concept is nature deficit disorder on the rise with young people. When I was a kid, you could run wild. I went out in the woods and played, and most kids spend an awful lot of time in the house on their devices. So back to this subject, how did this happen? Some of the details. What's missing? Well, we've already said it. That's missing, and that's missing. And some other things are missing. This is missing. People, we've been here for, some people think that people have been right here for 30,000 years. We're pushing back. When we arrived, our species arrived here all the time, in time. And these folks were not like your weekend hunter in Delaware or Pennsylvania. They hunted for a living, and they did it all year, and they did it whenever they needed to. So they were much, much more effective, just like they did. What you might not be aware of, we did have gray wolves, red wolves, cougars, also black bears, and also us. When Europeans first arrived, these were who was here eating deer, keeping the deer numbers where they should be. But did you know that before we arrived 30,000 years ago, actually before our numbers got high enough, about 15,000 to 12 to 15,000 years ago, jaguars roamed the streets of Newcastle County. They did.
Oh,
What happened to them? They said, there goes the neighborhood. They went to Mexico and Arizona and everywhere else down there, South America. They still persist in the tropics, and we think they're tropical species, but they're not. They would do fine here.
Let's bring it back.
And not only that, but brown bears did the same thing. There were grizzly bears here 12,000 or so years ago. And right alongside the black bears, just like there are now out in Montana and up in Alaska. But there's more. Before humans arrived, we also had dire wolves, American cheetahs, and the giant short-faced bear roaming right here. And if you've never heard of the giant short-faced bear, I don't know why is this cut off? Anyway, it's a big old bear. This is how big it is.
Oh.
This statue's at the revered tar pits in LA. And here is for scale. Giant short-faced bears, which lived here, were the largest land predators since the demise of the dinosaurs.
Wow.
And I photoshopped this in Pennsylvania,
Good for you.
pastoral Pennsylvania. So, as I mentioned, people were effective hunters for thousands of years in our area. Present day hunting is very limited as a means of regulating populations. So, as you know, the seasons are short, the hours are limited, you can't hunt before dawn or after dark. And the range, one of my colleagues at Penn State did one of my favorite experiments of all time. You know how people put radio collars on animals to see what the heck they're doing? Well, he put radio collars on hunters to see what the heck they're doing. And he found that hunters reported going a mile, a half a mile, and actually they went like 100 feet from the car. So the range of hunters today is not like what it used to be. Other predators, not year-round, 24/7, anywhere they can. Hunters traditionally in our part of the world like to target adult males, and the bigger the better. Other predators prefer lower risk prey, and that includes does. If you were to hunt out every single buck in a square mile but one, the next year you would still have the same number of fawns, right? It's just how they work. Present day hunters are narrowly limited in their methods. If you look at the weapons regulations, they're extremely precise. Other predators use every practical means, mostly ambush. Non-lethal effects are weak. And what are non-lethal effects? Well, I mentioned them before. Other predators alter the behavior and reproduction of deer and other herbivores just by their presence. This is called the ecology of deer. They make deer anxious. Mountain lions and wolves, just the smell of them makes them anxious. Their cortisol levels go up, just like ours do when we're anxious. Higher cortisol levels mean fewer triplets amongst those, for one thing. It means less time spent eating and making baby deer, for another thing. So, what can we do about it? That's the $64 million question. Hunting would seem to be the most logical thing because there's a whole bunch of people out there willing to do it for free. In fact, they pay for the privilege, big bucks. So it's cheap. Ideally, it's biology based. That doesn't always happen with state wildlife agencies. They're highly beholden, especially in Pennsylvania, on how, I don't know quite how it is in Delaware, but in Pennsylvania, we have a commission system there. The commission, the game commission, is beholden to the hunters. The hunters are what funds the game commission, for the most part, for a lot of the work that they do with their hunting licenses. And so most hunters think there's not enough deer, no matter how many there are. And the Game Commission is not necessarily going to look at biology and ecological carrying capacity when they're making their decisions.
Roger, how are how are the hunters paid? Are they paid by the head? Are they paid by the?
Hunters are not paid. They do the work totally for free. They pay for the privilege.
They pay to hunt. Oh, I know.
The deer, all wildlife belong to, basically, they belong to us, we the people. And the government has a fiduciary responsibility to us to manage our wildlife in a good way, in a way that's benefits, makes the most benefits. And so one of the ways they do that is to charge money for the privilege of killing a deer.
And how much is that?
I don't know, does anybody, any hunters in here? I personally am not a hunter, so I haven't bought a hunting license. I do have lots and lots of friends who are hunters, and I've never thought to ask them how much they pay.
It's enough to pay for a lot of other programs, because the licensing fees pays for a lot of other environmental activities
True,
in the state. So it's not just the license, but it's ammunition and the guns
exactly right.
and all of the other stuff.
The ammunition and the guns for hunting have a special tax on them that
Yeah,
goes to
tax,
these agencies, these wildlife management agencies. Well, as I mentioned before, the effectiveness is definitely limited. Weekend hunters,
enough
you know,
to
they're
be
not
killed.
hunting all the time like predators. So, and the practicality is limited. What do you do in a suburb like Arden? You know, you're not gonna have people with guns, that's for darn sure. But even with bows and arrows, there's probably not that much of Arden. Probably the Arden Woods is big enough for bow and arrow, as long as you put signs up and say people don't come in here this day, and this day. But those days aren't enough. It needs to be year-round proposition to be really effective. Contraception is one thing that comes up a lot when I'm giving talks and when other people are giving talks about this subject. And it seems like a great idea. Why can't we just give them a little birth control or something so that they don't have so many babies? Well, one of the problems is that it's unbelievably expensive. You have to capture each deer or at least get close enough to hit it with a dart. And deer, if they're being pursued, they know how to hide. It's amazing how invisible deer can become if they want to. And so it's, you know, you have to have an army of people out there to do it. And the next year, you got to do it all over and again and again. Furthermore, in some states, Pennsylvania being one of them, it's illegal. Because if you were to hit a deer with a contraceptive and then some, who knows, coyote were to eat the deer were to die of natural causes and somebody would eat it, then it would spread throughout the ecosystem. That's the least, that's what they say, why it's illegal. Build a fence. It's pretty darn expensive too. It also is not practical to build a fence around all of Arden, for example. And anyway, that would sort of shift the problem to all the neighboring neighborhoods. And also fences are surprisingly high maintenance. I have been in charge of a whole bunch of deer fences during my research career, and trees just love to fall on deer fences. But some people do it. This is a deer fence at the Tyler Arboretum near Media, Delaware County, PA, and they have two of them now. And this one encloses over 100 acres, and the other one encloses a little bit less than that. And it works.
Deer are inside the fence?
Sorry?
How many deer live inside the fence?
Well, that was the problem when they first built the fence. They had to chase them out, which they did. There's some big, well, you can see this is a dual purpose gate. This can be a vehicular gate. And it also, most of the gates are just for pedestrians. And all the trails that come in have their own gate. And, but when they had to drive the deer out after they built the fence and they opened up the big gates and a whole bunch of people formed the line and steered the deer towards the big gates. And here's an approach that you may or may not be aware of, is to contract sharpshooters to perform periodic culls. And a cull, a lot of people mix up the concept of culling and hunting. And it's not just a semantic difference. Hunting is what somebody pays for the privilege to do. You don't have to pay them. They are restricted by a whole bunch of laws. They get to keep the deer, and if they want to, they can donate it to a food bank, which lots of hunters do. And they do it for recreational purposes. And I think most of them do it to get out in the woods, because many of them are not. They never bring a deer home, and yet they do it year after year after year. This culling is basically just euthanasia. They go out there and they shoot as many deer as they can, and there's all the regulations are for human safety. They have to shoot down, they have to, they're allowed to bait, which a lot of hunters are not allowed to do in a lot of areas. They hunt in the middle of the night with infrared scopes so that people are not disturbed, because people are not walking out there in the middle of the night. And they always donate the food to food banks with the meat. Food banks are the recipients of all professional deer culling services. And it's pretty expensive. On the order of, I'd say, it depends on how they charge, but it might be $500 a deer. The biggest disadvantage is it's very hard for you to get a permit from the state. And I talked with the person who's in charge of deer in Delaware this morning on the phone, just to see if it was as much situation here as it is in Pennsylvania. And it is. They will give the permit, but only after a lot of back and forth. You have to make your case. You have to keep after them year after year until they finally have exhausted all of the ideas that they may have for you to deal with the deer situation other than culling. But I have been involved in some deer culls, and they work. In Rose Valley, we have had 2 deer culls in our nature preserve system, which is about 45 acres. And they were by crossbow, because Rose Valley is absolutely not big enough for any firearms whatsoever. And they were pretty successful. But again, our first call, we actually, because a lot of people were up in arms about it, and understandably, it sounds awful, but it's actually, when you think about it, it's a lot easier a death for a deer than being ripped apart by a mountain lion or a wolf, which is how deer have died for millions of years. So here's another one of my take-home messages. Monitoring the results of deer management. If you undertake a deer management program, it's vital to monitor the results. It's so rarely done. This is in Delaware County, PA, by the way. So one of the main reasons for monitoring is to maintain transparency for all stakeholders. Unless you monitor, and I'll get into this in a minute, it'll make more sense when I've told you a little bit more about monitoring. If you show results or no results or whatever, if it's open to the public, for everybody to see, then that's the only way to go, as far as I can see. You don't want to keep any secrets about it. So monitoring measures progress towards meeting your goals, whatever they may be. It shows what works and what doesn't. And it shows when to respond adaptively when conditions change, which they always will. It all just makes so much sense, and yet almost nobody uses the monitor. So how do you monitor? Count the deer? That's what most people, first thing that comes to mind. How many deer do we have, and how many deer should we have? Well, no. Number one, counting deer is unbelievably difficult and expensive. Number two, no one knows how many deer we should have. So it doesn't matter how many deer we do have. What monitoring consists of, in my mind, the only monitoring that matters is to measure the forest ecosystem responses to your deer management. Because that's what you care about. Your goals are going to be about the forest and the health of the forest and the health of the vegetation and the birds and the butterflies and everybody else. It's not going to be how many deer there are. So I want to tell you a little story about Rose Valley. I've done some fairly big experiments with replication in the whole business in various places, which are expensive. But we wanted to measure the impact of deer in our Rose Valley Nature Preserves. So we decided to do it kind of on the cheap, and it has worked out spectacularly. This is, I can't point to the one, but one of those younger people in there is an Eagle Scout wannabe, and the rest of them are his Scout buds and parents. And we decided to build a deer explosion, a deer fence. And one of the Eagle Scout candidates took that on as his project. And there it is finished. Give you an idea of the size of it. And it's not just the fenced area that we care about. The whole idea was to use the phytometer approach. It's been cut off. Phytometer, P-H-Y-T-O-M-E-T-E-R, means using a plant, we're using plants to measure something. In this case, we're measuring the impact of deer on vegetation. And the only way, really, you can measure that is by using plants, or by letting the plants measure it, and then we measure the plants. So what we did was, in these two plots are identical in size. One's fenced and one's unfenced. They're right next to each other, so they have the same soil, the same sunlight, the same everything. And we planted 95 plants, native plants in that one, and 95 native plants in this one. And these are the species we used. Notice the first three are shrubs. This native small tree. The rest of them are herbaceous perennials. And the scout made a map beforehand. The next scout, one scout built the fence. The next scout ran the planting operation. And here is the planting operation. And notice we got rid of all the vegetation that was there already. So both sides are starting from scratch. And talking about transparency a little bit earlier, we put up a nice sign inside the fence to explain what the heck this was all about. So in case somebody hadn't heard, they could, at least when they walk by, they could get the whole story, what we were up to with this whole thing. And here's the result. The top panorama is outside the fence, and the bottom panorama is inside the fence, about 1.5 years after the planting. And that, you can tell a lot just by looking, but I'm going to give you a little bit of statistics. So the survival of phytometers, the trees and shrubs, of the 20 I planted on, or we planted on within the fence, 11 survived. And of the 20 we planted outside the fence, 2 survived. The herbaceous plants, where deer were excluded by the fence, 33 of our 75 plants survived. Where deer were present, 17 of the 75 survived. this is even more spectacularly different. Of the trees and shrubs, the 18 plants that survived were an average of 2 meters tall. They were all this big when we planted. Were they on average 2 meters tall, 210 meters tall. And of the 3 plants that survived outside the fence, they were, well, I guess, and same with the herbaceous plants. And here is my favorite output. It's a little complicated, but I'll walk you through it. Where deer were excluded, this is how many species were living in the fence a year and a half after we did the planting. Most of them, virtually, well, practically all of them that we didn't plant, they just came in on their own. And natives are green, non-natives are purple. These were all the natives. There's some more natives up here that were less abundant. And there were altogether 34 species. Native species, 23. And evenness is another measure of diversity. In other words, if you have a field of corn and there's 10,000 corn stalks and 1 tiger lily stalk, and another field where there's 5,000 tiger lily stalks and 5,000 corn stalks, this one is more diverse because it's more even. This one is less diverse because it's overwhelmingly one thing. So the evenness was 0.214. Over here where deer were present, Japanese stiltgrass was practically the whole thing. There were a few native species, but they were very, very non-abundant. And the total species richness was 13 as opposed to 34, with 9 of them being native. And evenness was a much, much lower number than the evenness on the other side because Japanese stiltgrass was overwhelming. So that's my story about monitoring. You too can do it if you wish. So I just want to give a nod to the folks that took care of this ecosystem for many thousands of years. And you know they're still here, right? The Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania and Lenape Nation of Delaware, you know, 2, I think at least 2 Lenape Nations of New Jersey, etc. And another nod to some of our forebears on this continent. I love the great law of the Haudenosaunee, which are the Iroquois. The French call them Iroquois. In 1450, wrote this down, 7th generation principle. Makes so much sense. Here's Doug. Here's his books. I may have read any of his books. Loan them to your friends.
I do.
This is a quote from this person. All the public nature preserves in the world can't reverse the extinction crisis, or sequester enough carbon, or help us reach needed levels of climate resilience without also a pervasive change in how we steward private land. And Arden's nature preserves are private lands. Even though they're owned by a nonprofit, they're still not owned by the state. And each one of you's yard is private land, and it's really important what's done on all of those, because private lands by far outnumber in acreage all of the public lands.
Sort of,
Say again.
sort of,
Sort of.
private land.
Oh, sort of private.
Are you referring to Pennsylvania? Or like out west? Right.
Well, yeah, where the Bureau of Land Management is, those states have more public land than private land. I'm talking about the east. So your reading assignments will be, there will be an exam. This wonderful book, notice the one author there, is your name, talks about what I've been talking about. This came out a few years ago and it was funded by Audubon and it's still available online. This is a fascinating history book about the whole deer situation from the start. You know, Pennsylvania Game Commission was founded in 1890 because there were no deer left. Pennsylvania, virtually none. Pennsylvania Game Commission went to Michigan, trapped a bunch of deer, and trapping deer don't like to be trapped. They tend to die when they're trapped, but the survivors were brought to Pennsylvania, and they were successful. But there's been lots of ramifications since then.
What year was that they did that?
That they brought them in from Michigan. I think it was in the 1890s. It might have been around 1890. I love this book, Where the Wild Things Were. Life, Death, and Ecological Wreckage in a Land of Vanishing Predators. Really eye-opening. And about the whole world, not just Eastern United States. Now I want to introduce you to your very young deer nerd, of Sam Millman, who is the deer biologist for Delaware. And he allowed me to give his contact information in case he would like any advice from the top. He's available and happy to consult with anybody who wants to deal with their deer situation. He told me about a couple of programs in Delaware that I found intriguing. I'm not sure I can come up with the names, maybe if I stop. If I can stop doing this. Notes. They preach deterrence first, so they want you to plant deer resistant plants. Well, there's very, very few plants that are deer resistant. Some little that are natives. Yeah, the non-native probably. But there are places where there's no shrubs left in the forest understory except for spicebush. So it's fairly resistant. And there are other places where there's no understory woody plants left except for pawpaw, which is an awesome plant. I planted it in my yard and I have some to give away because I'm now run a pawpaw orchard. Not because I wanted to, but I hate to chop it down. I like to give them away. He also mentioned that there's a master hunters program in Delaware where the state actually, well, Sam himself, I think, probably actually trains people, gives people a couple of days training to work with communities to meet their deer management goals. But you don't have to pay them because they want to hunt. They just appreciate the opportunities that you might give them to do archery hunting in your parks. Another one is Delaware Hunters Against Hunger, which I was intrigued by. It's an organization. They do sort of very, what's the word, intensive hunting. They actually get together and they push the deer, and so that other hunters can get them. And each one is allowed to keep one, and the rest are donated to food banks. And I think that's about all I have to say for right now. I'd love to hear some questions. Yes.
What were your thoughts on like building deer sanctuaries or deer parks? Because I've been to quite a few throughout the world, like even one in Wisconsin. I don't know if you've been to any, but what do you think of that as a way, more humane way to control the deer population, as well as give people an amazing experience to be with deer? Japan has a whole island, Miyajima Island, that has more deer than humans. And they have some of the most pristine forests. I've been there 3 times. And it's one of the most beautiful places. And the deer just cohabitate with everyone. And it's just, you know, we don't have those problems that you mentioned here. I mean, what about doing something like that in Delaware.
So it'd be
Pennsylvania.
kind of like almost a zoo.
It doesn't have to be. In Japan, they kind of circulate around temples. In Slovenia, there's a deer park that I visit often, and they even brought some books about these deer parks. And the one in Slovenia, you'd never know, but they have fences. But again, you can go and feed them, kids can pet them. It's such a beautiful experience. And, in Japan, they're considered messengers of the gods, Shinto Buddhism, so it's illegal to hunt. It's illegal to kill a deer. But they've never had a problem. But the deer in those deer parks, there are a ton of deer, and the populations are growing. But, tourists come and feed them, and they buy, feed or corn. And that's one way I can, I'm not experienced in it. I just, it's a hobby for me. But, to see something like a deer sanctuary here would be amazing.
What do I think? I don't think, it's an interesting idea. It'd be kind of like setting aside areas for all terrain vehicle use. You just decide that this is the area is going to be for that purpose and nothing else.
I would totally run
You don't care about it.
it. I would be in charge.
I'm not sure how that would help the wider problem of deer causing ecological catastrophe.
I just have one comment. Our daughter lived in Japan for 3 years.
Yeah.
And we visited Japan, so I think I know a little bit different. But if you live, if you've been there, you know that the whole ethos of Japan is completely different from the United States. I mean, come on.
Well,
You know how Japanese society is.
Yeah.
It's not, I don't know about the deer park thing, but the Japanese model. There's a lot of things we could introduce would be great. Oh, I know, I'm not just, I'll talk to you.
Okay.
It's fine.
Yeah,
I'm
why
not
not?
opposed to deer park, I'm just saying, my own senses from not just personal experience, Mark, really, you can meet my daughter sometime, she can tell you about her experiences. She loved Japan, but, actually, she made an interesting comment after having lived, she spent her junior year abroad, and she was at Smith College, and then when she graduated, she didn't know what she wanted to do, so she went back to English to Japanese business for a couple of years. And she picked up a Japanese boyfriend for a little while, which didn't work out. But anyway, I said to her, well, do you think that you'll live in Japan? And she said, no. Now, this was 10 or 15 years ago, but I said, why not? She said, because they'll never accept me.
You'll never what?
They'll never accept me.
there's also a deer park in Wisconsin that's quite similar to the one in Japan. You can see this.
It's interesting that you should mention Wisconsin because
It's in the
the
Dells.
one place in all of Eastern North America that has the best deer management program, and you can see it through the vegetation. Their forests are thriving, and the native species diversity is immense. Is the Menominee Reservation in Wisconsin, and they have their own laws, and their laws are similar to what they were 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago, which is that they eat the deer. They hunt anytime they want to or need to, and they love the deer, so they're not trying to exterminate the deer, but their way of managing deer has resulted in just tremendous ecosystem non-deterioration in comparison to practically everywhere else. Yeah, there was one that.
So yeah, I
you
had
went first.
3 comments, so I'll try to be fast, I don't follow. First of all, it seems like you left out the elephant in the room in your very first comments, which was development of human habitation on what was previously deer habitat. And so, I can think of places in Delaware I know that deer were never a problem until a subdivision was put in. And you're taking obviously deer habitat and putting houses there. So, and then they're a problem where they weren't before. That's one point. Second point is, do you ever think about cars and their role as predators? When I think about having seen a field in White Clay Creek Preserve in Pennsylvania side, where I saw probably 300 or 400 deer piled up, and it was the dumping ground for the highway department. turkey vultures, black vultures,
Yeah.
everywhere. And then when I went back to that field 5 years later, there was nothing to be seen. They'd all been eaten. But, I mean, it really struck me that deers are and that cars are predators. Now,
Absolutely.
how long evolutionarily it will take for deer to recognize that, for people too, I mean, cars are predators to people as well, so,
I got
um,
an answer.
we have to, how long will it take before we become fearful of cars? Or fearful of people, that's the second point. Third thing I just wanna mention was, that Flint Woods Preserve, which is in Centerville, Delaware, they've moved from, leased agriculture to natural lands management and natural meadow management, and they found their deer problem disappeared. Like the hunters hated it because no longer were the deer on trails, but by taking out corn and soybean and putting in natural meadows, that all of a sudden the deer seemed to be a lot more controlled and they weren't causing the same destruction in the forest. And they were a bit mystified by the whole thing, but it was pretty interesting. They had like within 2 or 3 years, there was a really big difference in the deer population by switching to natural lands for the matter.
It will be interesting to see how that plays out over a longer period of time. But my guess is that the deer herd was what it was. And then when the meadows were put in, there was more food for them. And so they could spread into the meadows, or they preferred what was growing in the meadows to what was growing in the forest for a little while, but maybe their population is going to increase as a result of those
I'll
meadows.
be curious. I
Yeah.
haven't talked with them for the last 10 years, but I know when they first did it, there was a big difference.
I know, I should have asked you to just ask me one at a time. Now you have to remind me.
So habitat destruction as a cause, which you kind of didn't mention,
Well,
and then cars as predators.
suburban development, if it's 1 acre lots, it's not habitat destruction, it's habitat provision. I can tell you as an owner of a 1 acre lot, that the deer just love my property. And
They
there
love
may
your
be as many
acre.
deer or more deer in Rose Valley now than there were when it was more agriculture. Because we have a lot of deer. What was the middle one?
Cars as
Cars as predators, absolutely. The cars and hunters are pretty similar in their
Okay.
predation effectiveness. Unfortunately, that's a long word. You know, we don't want deer human car collisions. I heard a story that those deer piles that highway departments make, there's one in Pennsylvania that attracted golden eagles. People hadn't seen golden eagles in that neighborhood for a long time. They were eating the carcasses of the deer. But what was I going to say? Oh, it's not very effective because really, if you look or out of an airplane window or at a satellite photo of the world, you don't see that for roads. Roads make up a very small portion of the landscape.
But were deer really as much of a problem in areas that are really natural? I mean, the areas where we see them having deer problems, it's like Valley Forge National Park, which is a manicured landscape, suburban developments. I mean, our deer, yes, the woodland around here have a problem, but we're in the midst of a suburban developed area. Are there the same deer population problems in the national forests of northern Michigan, where there really isn't a lot of development? And so,
Yeah, that's a hard question.
Well,
for me
they
to answer.
have wolves in northern Michigan.
Yeah, they do have wolves, and also deer populations tend not to grow very large where the weather is really, really bad in the winter. A lot of deer get wiped out by breaking their legs in the ice and all kinds of wintertime mortality that we don't have down here. And we have less and less of now. When's the last time we had ice? It's been a while.
I guess closer to home would be your association with Penn State, the forests in Pennsylvania, don't they? Wouldn't that show some deer effect in the large tracts in Pennsylvania?
Oh, gosh, yes.
Yeah.
The people who make their living by selling wood, growing wood in the growing wood in the forest and selling it and on a cycle of timbering, they all put up temporary fences. When they do a cut, they take out the trees that they want, they leave shelter wood, and then they put a fence around it for, it stands for 5 to 10 years.
So they get those saplings.
It doesn't help the herbaceous plant diversity, but it does let the trees grow up above where they will be destroyed by the deer.
I have one other question about that. Since we're similar probably to Rose Valley and the nature preserve you have there. What's the acreage, first of all, of your preserve, and do you manage, besides the fence, deer in any way, or?
No, I'm glad you asked that question. We have 3 preserves, and we call it 3, even though they're contiguous, because they're not quite contiguous. They have Ridley Creek separating them, which is pretty wide as this room. And, but the deer bound right across the creek. But it's about 45 acres altogether. Yeah. One of the reserves has a parking lot right next to it, and it's so beautiful, and it's got trails. 2 of the preserves have trail systems that are very lovely, and people park in that parking lot, and more and more and more and more people have brought their dogs to walk on leash. At least they're supposed to be on leash. And we have found in that preserve and that preserve alone, trees are starting to reproduce again. And what can we?
Predators.
What
The
can
dogs
we
are the
get?
predators.
Exactly. Now, I tell people, thank you for bringing your dog. Little things that's big.
With the
Deer,
bars.
that's a wolf. It smells like a wolf. But deer doesn't make the judgment call on size. Anyway, I presume that it's the smell of what they leave behind, their urine, that makes the deer nervous. We see deer in there, but they're not killing off all the trees, which they've been doing for decades. The other preserves, one of them has virtually no dog walking, and the other one has a tiny little bit of dog walking, still not a single tree seedling. And we've done a whole lot of planting. We put wire fences around everything we plant, and outside those wire fences, there are no natives. Maybe a few
Where,
spice
do you
bushes.
get ephemerals in the spring? Do you get-
A little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, spring ephemerals are not too badly, except for the trilliums and the orchids and that. Things that deer really like.
Do you know why they had a sudden loss or big loss of the deer population in Pennsylvania that led to them bringing in deer in the 1890s?
I know exactly.
Unregulated hunting.
It was market hunting. Before then, it was legal for you to go out and shoot as many deer as you wanted to and sell the meat. And it is absolutely illegal to sell venison. If you're a restaurant and you want to sell venison, you have to get it from a New Zealand white-tailed deer farm.
So why? Is there any discussion like why is it illegal to hunt and
It was
sell?
illegal to do market hunting because deer were almost extinct and people wanted to bring them back. So they made a law, no more market hunting. Now it's kind of a religion. And what would solve the deer problem overnight almost is if they very carefully and regulatedly made a map and said you can market hunt here and here and here and here with a permit and sell your venison. Problem solved.
Problem solved.
But never spring that up in the company of government biologists, including SAM. I think we might move in that direction eventually, because you know why? Because hunting is becoming less and less and less popular.
Well, there's
Or
a
fewer
very
and fewer
close
people
correlation,
out
I would
hunting.
think, between the culling practice and the market hunting. Isn't that basically the same thing? You're just calling it a different name.
Absolutely. Except that the colors
Wow.
now are not allowed to sell meat.
Oh, I thought you said they, oh, they don't. Right, okay, you're right.
Not only do they sell it, one of the reasons why sharpshooter to do culling are so expensive is that they have to pay to have the deer dressed before they can
Yeah.
donate it. They don't
Wow.
haul a dead deer into the
To the food bank.
to the food bank. You have to pay a professional
butcher.
butcher. Yeah,
Oh, you can't do your own butcher.
I don't think well, they kill so many that would be, I guess you could hire a butcher to be on staff. I don't know whether any of them do that or not.
Interesting thought.
I think it goes back to the, FDA and food regulations, because you wanted, like with pork and other things too, you wanted to make sure that you had safe food. That's what I'm just saying.
Yeah,
But I have heard that the wild pig population of Houston, that there's a lot of hunters that are market hunting that, and a lot of times when you see wild boar in a restaurant, it's actually pigs from Houston
really.
that are, yeah, and that there's been a, dealing with the feral pigs in Texas is a huge problem.
I don't know whether you know or not, but we have feral pigs in our region. I don't know whether Sussex County in southern Delaware has feral pigs, but there are half a dozen or more counties in Pennsylvania that now have feral pigs. And the government will not allow that meat to be sold either, because if there's a market for it, then people will keep releasing baby pigs into the wild so they can harvest them and sell them. And they don't want that to happen.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Do you know if there's any, in the hunting world, not that you're a hunter, is there any test the meat for prion disease or anything?
Yes, they do spot testing only,
Oh,
and especially in the areas where mad deer disease, what's it called? Chronic wasting syndrome has been detected. They don't ask every hunter. Actually, in certain areas, they might ask every hunter to bring the head and give it to them for testing.
yeah, okay.
But I know they do spot testing all everywhere, like every 50th deer they haul out to test. Mhm.
It sounds to me from everything that's been said, probably the simple and immediate action should be just to say that people who walk their dog can take them off the leash when they're in the woods.
I don't know about that, but you can put them on a longer leash.
A longer leash. I know when I had a dog, I never saw the deer, and when my neighbors had a dog, I never saw any deer. And now neither of them have a dog, and I don't have a dog, I get to watch the deer.
Yeah, and watch them eat your garden.
I don't have a garden, so I don't care, but
My dog killed a deer once.
Oh my gosh, you must have a big dog.
He chased it in front of a car.
Oh. That's one smart dog. I've heard of, have you heard of crows doing that? Crows will wait for a car to come, then they'll scare the squirrel. The squirrel gets.
Crows are smart,
That's
Wow.
smart.
Crows are extremely smart.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yeah.